Today's Whiskey Flick is presented by Wayne Enterprises. For more than 100 years, Wayne Enterprises has been your trusted source for security, technology, food, shipping, biotech, and more. We've got our hands in so many industries, so no one asks what we really do around here. And we'll always sidestep the privacy concerns of the public so you don't have to. Wayne Enterprises is a proud sponsor of the Whiskey Flick podcast. Use promo code ARKHAM to receive 39% off your custom order. When it's darkest before the dawn, Wayne Enterprises is your hero. On today's Whiskey Flick, you can die the hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Grab a glass and let's put a smile on that face for the Dark Knight. Welcome back to Whiskey Flick. I'm your host, Terence Dunn, ready to dive into another awesome flick with our favorite whiskeys. I'm so excited to return to the world of comic book blockbusters and close out our double feature with our now back-to-back returning Whiskey Flick champion and fellow comics lover, Josh Callas. Josh, welcome back already to Whiskey Flick. What's new with you?
We had a baby shower, and that was fun. We got stuff ready for Wyatt to come into the world.
I appreciate you making some time to hop back on. I know you, much like me, are a comic book geek, and you love chatting about this stuff. And I know we've got a doozy of a movie after we recorded our Into the Spider-Verse episode. I know we chatted a little bit about how excited you were to talk about this movie. So we're not going to waste any time. We're going to get right into it. But before we do, hop into the Batmobile and make our way to Gotham City for the Dark Knight. Let's talk about what's on tap for today. So Josh, as always, what are you sipping on this evening?
I'm actually not having anything right now, and I feel like I let you down.
You are good. Any liquid sustenance?
Iced tea.
You got to keep things balanced. As far as my drink for this evening, I actually do have a little bit of Maker's Mark. It's a 110 proof small batch Maker's Mark. It is really strong, but it is really good. It's got a great flavor to it, especially if you like Maker's Mark or small batch whiskeys.
I'm talking about the kind of city that idolizes a masked vigilante.
Gotham City is proud of an ordinary citizen standing up for what's right.
Gotham needs heroes like you, elected officials, not a man who thinks he is above the law.
Exactly. Who appointed the Batman?
We did. All of us who stood by and let scum take control of our city.
But this is a democracy, Harvey.
When their enemies were at the gates, the Romans would suspend democracy and appoint one man to protect the city. And it wasn't considered an honor, it was considered a public service.
Harvey, the last man that they appointed to protect the Republic was named Caesar, and he never gave up his power.
Okay, fine. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Before we get into the details of the movie, as we mentioned at the top of the show, we are closing out our look at comic book blockbusters by revisiting 2008's genre-defining and Academy Award-winning The Dark Knight. Josh, I think we all know Batman is a seminal character at this point in both comics and film. He would be on the Mount Rushmore of comic book characters. So before we get into the movie, talk about your start with Batman and what really draws you to the Batman character.
Batman is by far my favorite comic book character. I actually have Joker and Harley Quinn tattoos, which are kind of douchey, but it speaks to how much I love them. Since I was a kid, there was the animated series. I remember McDonald's had the toys from the animated series I loved. So I've always just drawn to Batman, and the thing that draws me to Batman is twofold. One, I'm probably going to upset some people. I hate Superman. I think he is not a great character. I think he has a new power every week. He's just not interesting to me. Batman has some depth to him, especially with the way it's been written lately. He's a dark character. There's absolutely a dark side to someone who responds to his parents' death by training his body to the ultimate peak of human perfection and dressing like a bat and beating dudes up every night. That's a twisted dude. The other thing is his villains. Most good superheroes are made by their villains. Batman hands down has the best rogues gallery when it comes to villains. Obviously, Joker's the iconic one, but even Riddler and Two-Face and Penguin, and then, I mean, you even get into newer ones like Hush and Red Hood before he becomes kind of good again. Like, there's some, like, realism there. Obviously, like, we'll get into it, but this movie brought that out. And there's just more to him than your typical superhero.
Love the way you characterize that. You mentioned Hush specifically, which, shit, is a great book. If you've not had the opportunity to read that, there's a graphic novel version of it, so you don't have to go out and find the actual issues. But other than Hush, are there any other favorite Batman stories that you've really enjoyed over the years?
This movie's based on a couple. So The Long Halloween, probably one of his most famous ones. Along with that comes Haunted Night. One of them that I really love is The Serious Arkham on a Serious Earth. To most Batman fans, I do like the New 52 story, specifically like the Court of Owls and some of the Batman Rebirth stuff. There's a ton, man. That's, like I told you before, like probably 90% of my comics are Batman.
Man, you named off quite a few like really epic stories. And that's kind of the cool thing, right? Is Batman's been around as a character for so long. So you've got all these iconic stories. And the really cool thing to your point is they brought in different writers and different storytellers. They're not just recycling or retreading the same stories. I think the thing that drew me most to, and if you look at the list of favorite characters for me from comic books, they're all broken to some degree. Batman is really high up there for me. Characters like Wolverine are really high up there for me. I just really appreciate stories that deal in physical, narrative, and emotional complexity. And I feel like those characters, in particular Batman, really do. So I love the fallibility of Batman. I love that Batman is complicated. I love that Batman doesn't always make the right choice. I like that he has complicated motivations with complicated outcomes. Heroism is messy. And I think this film and Batman stories generally do a good job of that.
Should we give in to this terrorist's demands? Do we really think that
You'd
he's
rather
gonna...
protect an outlaw vigilante than the lives of citizens?
The Batman is an outlaw. But that's not why we're demanding he turn himself in. We're doing it because we're scared. We've been happy to let the Batman clean up our streets for us until now.
Things are worse than ever.
Yes, they are. But the night is darkest just before the dawn. And I promise you, the dawn is coming.
All right, so let's get into this whiskey flick. Before we get into our own personal experiences with the film, a few fast facts for us to consider about the film itself, as well as the people who worked on it. First of all, the film was released in July 2008 as a sequel to Batman Begins. And I remember just being completely blown away by it. The movie opened to $158 million in the US. It was the #1 film in the US that weekend, and it smashed records all over the place. It was the top grossing film of the year. It was the first superhero film to cross the $1 billion worldwide mark. Obviously, there's been quite a few that have done that since. In addition to making a ton of money, it received universal acclaim upon release. This one was loved by both audiences with an A cinema score rating and also by critics, 84% Metacritic and a 94% Rotten Tomatoes. So this film was loved. It also got a lot of accolades in terms of awards. Probably the most well-known was Heath Ledger, who received a number of posthumous awards for his performance as the Joker, including a Best Supporting Actor Oscar, also won at the Golden Globes and the Screen Actors Guild Awards. At the People's Choice Awards, it was selected as the top movie, and it also was selected for preservation in the Library of Congress. So this movie does have some pretty remarkable historic precedent, especially given that it's really not that old at 14 years. A few other interesting facts about how the film came together. The writers, which we'll talk about in a moment, the Nolan brothers, were actually primarily influenced by crime dramas. And when you think about that in the context of this movie, it makes so much sense. You know, they look to movies like Heat and The Godfather, and oh my God, you can see the fingerprints of those movies on this one, right? Like these movies read like a Heat, like a Scarface, these high intensity, high octane, dark crime dramas, you know, like the Michael Mann movies, I think would be another good representation here. But you really see more of that than the traditional superhero film, which at the time would have been, you know, the Tim Burton Batmans or the Christopher Reeve Superman film. We already mentioned, obviously, the Frank Miller books too, which were a huge influence. This was the first movie filmed with 70mm IMAX cameras. I couldn't believe that when I read it, because for some reason in my mind, IMAX has always been a thing, but this was the first one filmed with these massive 70mm IMAX cameras that had only been used previously for documentaries. They fucking broke one during filming. I don't know what scene it was, but they broke it, and apparently they were very expensive cameras at the time because they were not digital, they were actual film. It cost $250,000 to replace. One of the things that I really enjoyed, and we'll talk about more here when we get into the movie, was there was a big emphasis on practical effects and in stunts, right? So compared to the superhero movies of today, which are like massive CGI fests, this thing is full of practical stunts, whether it's Bruce Wayne standing on the top of what is in real life Willis Tower, or the flip of the semi, the explosion at Gotham General Hospital, even some of the bits in the final confrontation, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, where there's actual stuntmen falling out of buildings, including Heath Ledger, who actually performed his own stunt dive at the end of the movie. Wild. I love that he and Christian Bale both performed some of their own stunts, which is really cool and just shows a neat level of commitment. This obviously has helped make it into the gold standard for superhero films. You can't have a conversation about superhero movies in the modern era without talking about The Dark Knight. And last but not least, a few other just fun random facts that I came across. The film features a cameo from Matt Skiba from Blink-182 and Alkaline Trio. Didn't know that till I read it, went back and watched it, and my mind was blown. So Matt Skiba is originally from Chicago, and if you go watch the scene where there is the throng of people banging on the doors at the news station to kill Reese, the lawyer who the Joker has offered up a bounty on, you can see him actually standing right in the front.
That's funny. My wife is freaking out right now about that.
Yeah, you guys are going to go back and watch that clip like right afterward.
Yeah, pretty much.
The other piece obviously is calling out some of the elements of the Joker's story, which were particularly pertinent. I love that apparently Heath Ledger actually did film and direct the homemade videos that you see the Joker do. So any of the handheld pieces, that was all him. He was very much infamously, I mean, I don't think we need to get into it a ton because I feel like it's pretty well known at this point how he did not break character on this film. He was in character on set all the time, and he was actually secluded in a hotel for 6 weeks prior, logging some pretty gnarly content in a Joker journal as he was getting himself into his headspace. A lot of really fascinating things on a really fascinating film that, you know, has a important place in comic book and cinema history. Josh, any thoughts on some of the fast facts on the movie?
No, I mean, you hit on the Heath Ledger thing about the diary and everything. I kind of read into some of the stuff that he put in there. As a fan of Batman and a fan of Joker, like dead on with where his mind was. He really set the idea of like what Joker is for me. You also brought up the stunts, like the Christian Bale pieces. He saw his stuntman getting ready to stand up on that tower, and he was getting upset, went to the director and was like, no. Convinced him to let him do it, which is just crazy to think about. I mean, honestly, if you take all three of them as a trilogy, which is its own podcast, but it's almost more about the city of Gotham and how they set that into an actual very real place, whereas the Batman movies before were like big set pieces. I don't want to say cheesy, but they were trying to do for a different comic kind of thing, and it really made it like a living and breathing city.
I would absolutely agree with that. Christopher Nolan has said in interviews before that part of that was not only his view of the Batman, like his own kind of organic experience from reading the books, but also as almost a cathartic response to the Joel Schumacher movies, which I think are probably the pinnacle of that set piece version of Batman that you're talking about. Like you could pick it apart in the Tim Burton movies too. Those are also very soundstagey type movies, but I think they also got the grit because of Tim Burton. But if you go back and try to watch like Batman Forever or Batman and Robin, they're these bright, colorful, shticky, they're big, dumb, loud action movies. So that was kind of the response to it, but I love the way that you characterized it as bringing realism to the city. I'll even take that a step further and say that I think Christopher Nolan did a remarkable job in making Gotham both a real place, but also a character. Gotham is very much a character in this movie, and I can't wait to talk about that because I got a lot of love for Chicago. I think the fact that they filmed this movie in Chicago is important to how it became its own character. You mentioned the Christian Bale stunt. It's kind of surprising when you read about the history of stunts on this movie. There was some dangerous shit in this movie. Like, we're going to talk about the semi-stunt a little later. We're going to talk about Christian Bale standing at the edge of Willis Tower or Heath Ledger dangling 70 feet from a building. It's kind of crazy to think about. And this movie was not without incident. There was actually a stunt person who died during the making of this movie. So it's kind of remarkable that Warner Brothers let them push the envelope that much. I think it feeds into the final product, but also like there was clearly a risk tolerance for danger on this movie that I think you wouldn't see in 2022. We'll talk a little bit about the crew, and then we got to talk about this amazing cast. So first of all, the crew, we already mentioned Christopher Nolan. He was the director and co-writer. He co-wrote the film with his brother Jonathan. Christopher Nolan is a household name at this point. Prior to this, he made the film Memento, which is amazing and one I want to revisit. He obviously directed the entire trilogy. He also made films like Inception, Interstellar, and Tenet, most of which he co-wrote with his brother. Shout out to Wally Pfister, the cinematographer. I fucking love the cinematography in this movie. It is a gorgeously filmed movie. It's lensed different than Batman Begins. Begins, I think, in a really, really awesome way. It's got these like grayish, bluish hues that I think make a really interesting shift in the way that the movie looks. He was also a frequent Nolan collaborator. And then we got to shout out composers Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard, because the music in this movie is amazing. They actually composed it apparently without seeing the film. You get a lot of industrial references like Kraftwerk, and they actually won a Grammy for the album. Incredible, unnerving music. Let's talk a little bit about the cast, and then Josh, we got to break this one down a little bit because obviously we got to talk about a couple of iconic performances here. So we'll start first, obviously, with Christian Bale, who portrays Batman and Bruce Wayne in the film. He was started as a child actor. He's probably outside of this role, most well known from his performances in American Psycho, The Prestige, The Big Short, Ford v Ferrari, and he was most recently Gore the God Butcher in Thor, Love and Thunder. Josh, any thoughts or takes on Christian Bale's performance as Batman and maybe how this fits for you within the on-screen Batman? Does he fit in your top three?
Yeah, he's absolutely top three. Playing Batman's tough because you're playing two characters, right? You got to be able to pull off the Bruce Wayne part without being cheesy, but also come across as someone who could actually believably kick your ass. I mean, I think he does a good job with that. Bruce Wayne is always tough to pull off in these movies, and if I'm being honest, I don't think anyone's really pulled that off super well. The only criticism I have of Bale is probably the voice on the rewatch of Batman, and that's mostly because if you know the comedian Pete Holmes, he has a whole like web series of Badman where he does a parody of the voice, so it's right here now. But outside of that, like, he really captured kind of that focused mission of what you would have to be Batman, and just that was his everything, you know? Like, I mean, but no, he nailed it. I mean, because before that, you had George Clooney and Val Kilmer were the last Batmans before that. Michael Keaton was okay. He was good, I guess. It's just hard for me to picture Michael Keaton fighting people.
How would you round out the top three?
I mean, can I include the animated?
Sure. We're giving a shout out to Kevin Conroy.
Yes, that voice is Batman for me. Christian Bale would be there. Unpopular opinion, I actually don't think Ben Affleck was terrible. I think he pulls off an older Batman. He probably pulls the Bruce Wayne of it all better than anyone that does. And I think Bale does the Batman part better than anyone.
I think that's fair, and I think that's a solid top three. I'll agree with you. Like, the whole Bruce Wayne Batman performance is tough. It's the Spider-Man Peter Parker problem here too. Like, sometimes you get a great Peter Parker, sometimes you get a great Spider-Man. The point of having a secret identity is that it doesn't match your real identity, but that also means that it's tough to play both because they should be different from each other, and usually actors are going to be better at one than they are at the other. I'll agree with you though. I think Christian Bale's performance is awesome. I actually had the opposite take after rewatching this movie on the Batman voice. It's been a joke, I think, for quite some time. You know, Christian Bale, the Batman word, like, it's just that kind of snarl. And I think on the first rewatch, it was like, oh, there's the Christian Bale voice again. But the second time I watched it, it just didn't bother me as much, just because I was already kind of expecting it. But two, the more I thought about it, again, thinking back to this idea of secret identity, of course, he's trying to kind of scramble his voice a little bit. It's over the top. It probably didn't need to be that crazy, but it was clearly intentional. Like, it was clearly a part of it was a clear character choice, and I don't entirely hate it. As far as my own top three, I love the Kevin Conroy shout out. I loved Batman the Animated Series growing up, so if we're including that, then that's going to be up there for me. If I go strictly film, I will probably put Christian Bale at the top. I do like his Batman. I think his Bruce Wayne is solid. I'll give some love to Michael Keaton. That was a Batman I really, really grew up with because I'm old enough to have watched the first Batman in theaters. I will also, and this may stoke some controversy, I'm interested to see if Twitter hates on this, I will include Robert Pattinson in my top three. I really enjoyed his performance in the Batman. I would like to see more of it. And I say that as somebody who thought it was the dumbest casting of all time because in my mind, he was the Twilight guy. Like, I hadn't seen him in anything else. And he absolutely nailed that performance.
You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. I can do those things because I'm not a hero. Not like that. I killed those people. That's what I can be. No, you can't. You're not. I'm whatever Gotham needs me to be.
Now, the other big performance we got to talk about in this, and this is probably the one that tends to get more love just in terms of like the historic nature of it, is Heath Ledger's iconic performance as the Joker. Obviously, prior to this, he was in the film 10 Things I Hate About You. He's also appeared in The Patriot, A Knight's Tale, Lords of Dogtown, and Brokeback Mountain. Sadly, before he did pass away, about 6 months before this movie came out, hence the posthumous Academy Award for his performance. I think this performance has been talked about pretty extensively just in media in general. role. But Josh, for you, I know you mentioned you're a big Joker fan. What are your thoughts on Heath Ledger as the Joker?
He was perfect. He just captured what I've always thought Joker really would be. He said it in the movie, he's an agent of chaos. When I first got the movie, when it first came out on DVD, there were times where I wouldn't even watch the whole movie. I just watched Joker scenes. He just captures the whole thing. I mean, if you really think about who this movie about, it's probably Harvey Dent and like his rise and fall. But Joker and Heath Ledger just stole everything from the minute he's on the screen and captures the character so great.
How would you say this compares to other Batman film villains?
I'd place him number one. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. I don't think that's a real argument at all. I think it would be him, and then there's a lot of space. I think you ask most people. I mean, one, he's playing Batman's iconic villain, but also just the performance. I would think most people associate the Joker with that performance.
I'll agree with you. I think that this performance is top tier. I think one of the reasons why it's so compelling is because if you grew up reading the Batman books, especially like the Frank Miller books, and I think they've done a really good job with some of the recent Joker books, the Joker is supposed to be scary. He's kind of funny, but he's also supposed to be kind of scary. It's not a perfect comparison, but Freddy Krueger, you yuck it up a little bit, but also he's supposed to be a scary dude. I think that the Nolan brothers stumbled upon the way to make one of, if not the most terrifying film villains of all time, because how do you stop a villain that lacks all reason and motivation outside of just burning the world down? He's not driven by money. He's not driven by people. He's driven by a pure sense of anarchy and destruction. He literally just wants to twist the city in the wind and gives no fucks about any of it. Like, that is truly terrifying. There's something really, really dark and frightening about a villain that just lacks all reason and motivation.
It's captured when the scene in the interrogation room where he's just getting beat up by Batman, and he's like, you have nothing to do with all your strength. Like, he does not care if you beat him to a pulp. And in the comics, I mean, half the time his plans involve getting captured and going to Arkham. A lot of times, like, you'll see psychiatrists, like in real life, are able to profile criminals. Just can't imagine you could even build a profile on a guy like that.
And I know we've talked on this podcast actually before. Matt and I talked about the all-time greatest film villains, and this performance was one that came up. I think that speaks to kind of the deeper fear. This performance is bigger than a comic book villain, and I don't mean to say that in like a condescending way, but it rises to the top of all genres.
You want to know how I got these scars? My father was a drinker and a fiend. And one night, he goes off crazier than usual. Mommy gets the kitchen knife to defend herself. He doesn't like that. Not one bit. So, me watching, he takes the knife to her, laughing while he does it. He turns to me and he says, "Why so serious?" He comes at me with the knife. "Why so serious?" He sticks the blade in my mouth. "Let's put a smile on that face."
Let's give a quick shout out to the rest of the cast, and then we'll dive in a little deeper here. We have Michael Caine, who played Alfred. He's been around for ages. You know him from Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, Kingsman. He's been in a ton of Christopher Nolan movies. Morgan Freeman, who portrayed Lucius Fox, Driving Miss Daisy, Shawshank Redemption, Seven. I mean, these are people who have been like stars of massive films. Gary Oldman is what would eventually be Commissioner Gordon. Was in True Romance, The Fifth Element. He appeared in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, along with dozens of other films. Aaron Eckhart, who is, you mentioned this, but Harvey Dent is the central protagonist of this movie in a really interesting way. For a Batman movie, Batman doesn't go through the central character journey, and neither does Joker. Both of those characters at the end of this movie are the same. They're unchanged or unmoved largely by the events of the film, but Harvey Dent is changed from where we see him at the start of the film. And so I think that performance from Aaron Eckhart in that was pretty impressive. He was in movies like Aaron Brockovich, Thank You for Smoking, Maggie Gyllenhaal, who took over the part of Rachel Dawes. Rachel Dawes was played by Katie Holmes in Batman Begins. Maggie appeared in Donnie Darko. She was also in the film Crazy Heart. I also just randomly want to shout out Anthony Michael Hall from, a number of John Hughes movies, 16 Candles, Weird Science, right? All those movies. He plays the newscaster that you see a few times in the film. Josh, we've talked now a little bit about personal experiences with Batman, so there might be a little bit of overlap here, but as we dive into the movie, let's talk first impressions. I know I shared my story already of when I first saw the film. Tell me a little bit about your experience with the film.
First saw it back home, Banning in Fox Theater. I believe I saw it a few days after after it came out during the week when I get off work. And then I went back that night and saw it again. I think I saw this film probably 4 or 5 times when it was in theater. It just really captured what I had saw in the more adult comics, right? And we weren't really getting something like this from superhero movies. It showed you can tell a superhero movie in a very real way with a very real story. I loved it.
So Josh, let's break this down. And I'm going to go ahead and start with what you just mentioned there, because we've now talked about it a couple of times. And I think it's something that strikes you pretty quickly when you watch the movie. And that's the tone of the film. You've talked a lot about the dark, gritty realism. And I think that Chicago plays an interesting role in that and why it was so successful in that regard. And this was the second film where Chicago has been Gotham City. It first was in Batman Begins, although much more briefly. This time the film is centered in Chicago, and they actually filmed in Chicago again for the Batman. So it's kind of cool to see them return to Chicago. The more that I thought about it, as I'm seeing all these iconic sites around Chicago, it got me thinking about my own time visiting Chicago and how Chicago is kind of the most Gotham City in the United States. It's an incredibly urban space with impressive scale, like the architecture of the city. If you've never been to Chicago, the architecture in this city is just unbelievable. It's a city that is spectacle. But I also was thinking about it too, and Chicago has kind of established itself as a city of haves and have-nots, much in the way that Gotham is. There are parts of Chicago that are very impoverished and very run down, and people are struggling to get by. And then you have things like the Miracle Mile, Michigan Avenue, these very kind of high-end, high-dollar areas where people with lots of money live in penthouses. And so it's this really interesting dichotomy in the real city of Chicago, and I think they did an awesome job of capturing that in the film. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Chicago as the stand-in and also just in general about the tone of the film.
Gotham is a place where people walk around and you're just completely enveloped by these giant buildings. You know, almost it makes you feel very small. I've only been to Chicago once, but when me and Phil went, that was the thing I came away from it is I had never seen structures so big, and it really makes you feel tiny. And I feel like that is how you would walk around Gotham. And you said it perfectly with the have and have-nots parts, because that's the other thing that struck me is there are definitely those areas in Chicago. You see, I mean, all cities have this, but you really do see like the type of the layout and the way the buildings and everything change, and you can tell what type of area you're in. And I think it was perfect to film Gotham. I think Gotham can be kind of hard to film, especially when you're comparing to the comics, because in the comics there'll be these huge structures that just probably don't exist anywhere. But Chicago really got close.
And it's interesting because the city's almost constructed in that way. Like not just in terms of the architecture, but in terms of like, to your point, you can kind of drive around and see where they've invested and where they're not investing, like where money's going and where it's not. And it's a choice, right? And it's a choice that empowers certain people and disempowers others, and it's intentional. And that sounds like Gotham City government to me. Like the mayor and Harvey Dent, supposedly they want to come in and clean things up. That's certainly not the Gotham that has taken place before the events of this film. The Gotham before the events of this film is corrupt bureaucrats and corrupt law enforcement that are taking money and taking charge of the city, and the mob's running it over. And so I think Chicago's a more than applicable stand-in for Gotham City. You talked about the opening, and I'm going to give you the mic on that one because we can't not break this down, not literally scene by scene, but by highlighting a few of these. And that opening bank heist sequence is incredible. Talk a little bit about like what your thoughts were revisiting that scene.
It puts you right in the action, right? It doesn't start off slow or anything like that. One thing I loved is the guy giving the little speech about how it's going to work and like 2 shares is plenty. And I know why they call him the Joker. I love that voice because it is the perfect just henchman villain in Gotham voice from the cartoons or video games. I don't know who that guy is, but it's like perfect in my mind. Then as it gets going and you see like the plan is to kill the guy in front of you and everything, that just seems like as that was happening, I was like, oh my God, that's exactly how Joker, who hasn't started a gang yet or doesn't have henchmen yet, would do it. It's just perfectly done. And then the shots of when they're ziplining across the city, all of that's just beautifully done. William Fichtner, I think that's how you say it, he plays the bank manager, and you had mentioned how it has kind of a Heat feel, and that was one of Nolan's things. That was like an homage to Heat, that whole sequence, and then obviously throwing him in there. But one of my favorite scenes, and it's just right off the bat.
I have vivid memories of experiencing that in the theater because it was like we get into this movie and we're in it. Instantly immersive. You've got this fast-paced, high-concept action that's happening. I think to your point, this is his first stamp referencing Heat. You've got parallel action where we're following different characters at different places, but the pace is going. It's really, really rapid. I think it also helps that this was one of the scenes they filmed with the IMAX cameras. It's just very visceral and very, very action-oriented. And the funny thing that I walked away with on the revisit was that became the blueprint for those kind of scenes in every Christopher Nolan movie after this. Whether it's Inception or Interstellar. I mean, shit, the very next movie, Dark Knight Rises, they've got the scene with the plane. He very much had a specific thing he wanted to do here, and this became his trademark. And so it was cool to go back and see kind of where it all started. I also love that this scene, you mentioned the bank manager, it sets the tone of what the action pace is going to be like, that we're going to get that heart-pounding crime thriller aspect throughout this, which was at the time unconventional for superhero movies. But I also love that it gives us such an early characterization of the Joker. We very quickly are being indoctrinated into the Joker as an agent of chaos. Throughout that sequence, you mentioned the clowns. They've all been directed to kill the next guy up. And then the scene ends with the bank manager yelling at the Joker.
The guy that hired yous. He'll just do the same to you. Oh, criminals in this town used to believe in things. Honor. Respect. Look at you. What do you believe in, huh? What do you believe in?
I believe whatever doesn't kill you simply makes you a stranger.
You end that scene understanding this is a dude that is all about chaos, all about jumping ahead a little bit, but what Alfred refers to as some men like to watch the world burn. We get that characterization so fast, and they spend the rest of the movie unpacking that further. But by the end of that scene, you recognize that the Joker is not just any old villain. This is a fucked up dude who is going to do some fucked up stuff because he has no morals. He has no baseline. He has no goals that he's trying to achieve outside of burning the world down. And to get all that in the first 5 minutes of the movie is wild.
Well, and then the idea that this is a mob bang, you don't do this, which kind of really just lets you know where Gotham's at that point, because I'm sure everyone knows that's a mob bang. He doesn't care. He's not scared of anything. He's not scared of anyone.
I don't want to steal all the thunder on this movie, but I wanted to make sure that we started with the opening piece. So, Josh, were there any other key scenes or key moments that really stood out to you?
There's the rooftop scene where Batman, Commissioner Gordon, and Harvey Dent are meeting. Harvey Dent has turned on the bat signal. One, that's a really cool reference to The Long Halloween, where they decide we're going to go after the mob. As soon as I saw that, I was geeked. But it's really cool. It sets up that dynamic. These are three men who do generally want to do good in Gotham. And they're probably the only 3 out of the 4 good men in Gotham, if you count Alfred. And so it just kind of sets up their dynamic really cool, because Dent doesn't trust anyone that's a cop, really. You can kind of see that even with, I think Gordon's probably the only one he really trusts. And even then, my other favorite scene would probably be the interrogation. You get both characters' motivations in that. And Joker, just him laughing at it. To me, he's always loved Batman because Batman is a joke to him, in the sense that he's like, how is this man different than I am? He's hurting people that you approve of him hurting. It's the only difference.
I agree with you on the conversation between the 4 of them, and I love that you called out that Dent, Gordon, Bruce Wayne, Alfred, I would also even pull in Lucius Fox to that conversation as being sort of like the pinnacles of righteousness and clear moral compass, because this movie does delve into ethics a lot. I know we'll talk about themes here when we wrap up, but this film is very much about morality, ethics, and the nature of good and evil and how you define good and evil, and the complex degrees of good and evil that exist in the real world. But I think it's fascinating that those characters, right, as they come together and we understand them as representing the moral compass of the film. I don't know if the movie's necessarily trying to say something here, but it's fascinating to me that of that group of 5, the one that's held up is the light in the darkness is Harvey Dent. He's the hero that Gotham needs. He's supposed to be the best of us, I think is even a phrase that gets used at one point in the movie. And yet he's the one that the Joker is able to corrupt. The whole point Joker's trying to make with Harvey Dent's storyline is the corruptibility of heroes. Anybody could be made a villain with the right influence.
You didn't think I'd risk losing the battle for Gotham's soul in a fistfight with you. No. You need an ace in the hole. Mine's Harvey.
What did you do?
I took Gotham's White Knight, and I brought him down to our level. It wasn't hard. See, madness, as you know, is like gravity. All it takes is a little push.
And so I think it's really fascinating that the man who was held up as the best of us actually ends up being the one who is corrupted by the end of the film. And you could make an argument that the other four are incorruptible. They maintain their moral compasses throughout the film. Like Lucius Fox even stands up to Bruce Wayne at one point with the sonar detection taking place across the city. The four of them don't lose sight of their moral compass. Now, granted, Dent endures different circumstances than the other characters. He still ends up the furthest down that journey. The other piece you mentioned was the interrogation scene. I think is one of the best Batman Joker scenes outside of probably the final confrontation. There's so many interesting things going on in the interrogation. I appreciated the way that it was filmed. It's kind of like a subtle thing, but you notice when interrogation sequence first starts, you've got Gordon talking to the Joker, and it's like total film noir. It's dark. The characters have like shadows on their faces. It's like a very classic kind of film noir, and the conversation is very mysterious and dodgy, and he's not getting anywhere. And then it's interesting to me that when Batman then enters the interrogation room, all the lights come on. It's this very bright, ugly fluorescence that the scene takes place in. And the scene itself is pretty brutal as Batman's beating the shit out of him, slams his head into the glass, like the bulletproof glass, and it breaks it.
This could just be me, what I took from it. So that starts where Batman's in the dark. That's where Batman is comfortable, is being in the dark. Once he leaves, all that light comes on. And in my mind, the way I interpret it is the Joker's comfortable. The Joker has nothing to hide. He is who he is all the time. And with all that light, you see Batman get more agitated, obviously, because he's captured Dent. Maybe it's just me reading into it. Joker's making him uncomfortable because he's showing him. And Joker embraces his ugliness and just trying to reflect that at Batman, who doesn't want to see it. I mean, and maybe that's not what they were going for, but that's how I take it. That's the essence of who those characters are.
I think that's super fascinating. And you're right. Like, Joker doesn't shy away from who he is. We've already talked about that quote a few times. He talks about himself being an agent of chaos. When he's talking to Harvey Dent in the hospital, he hands him the gun and talks about introduce a little anarchy. If I'm going to be honest, the unsung hero of this movie, and I feel like it's just because you don't hear a lot of people talk about it. Can we get some love for the fucking script of this movie? Because the script's out of control, not even just in terms of the plotting and the action set pieces, but the dialogue in this movie, whether it's, you know, the Joker's monologues, or at one point I started taking notes of some of the iconic lines that you hear in the movie. Probably the most well-known is you either die the hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. What an incredible piece of dialogue. We already talked about Alfred's story that ends in some men have no logic, some men just want to watch the world burn. I jotted down from the closing monologue, sometimes the truth isn't good enough. Sometimes people deserve to have their faith rewarded. Dude, what a fucking script. Like, again, we're going to get to that scene because obviously that closing monologue from Gordon is super important to the ending of the film. I just feel like Jonathan Nolan doesn't get enough love for his work on this script.
You've changed things. Forever. Then why do you want to kill me? I don't want to kill you. What would I do without you? Go back to ripping off mob dealers? No. No, you complete me. You're garbage who kills for money. Don't talk like one of them. You're not. Even if you'd like to be. To them, you're just a freak. Like me. They need you right now. But when they don't, they'll cast you out. Like a leper. You see, their morals, their code. It's a bad joke. Dropped at the first sign of trouble. They're only as good as the world allows them to be. I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other. See, I'm not a monster.
I'm just ahead of the curve.
I was blown away to learn that the magic trick, and obviously referring to the scene in which he's meeting with the mob bosses and Joker slams a henchman's head on the table, sending a pencil that had been stabbed into the table into his eye, which immediately kills him. It's a pretty brutal sequence. I was really impressed to learn that much like most of the things in this movie, that was a practical stunt. There's no CGI in that sequence. It was literally somebody swiping the pencil away prior to his head being slammed onto the table. 2 shots just edited together. And I have a deep love for practical effects. Anytime you bring in stunts and real action, it adds to the believability and the realism, which I think is something that this movie does really well. And if I'm going to be at all critical of newer superhero movies, I think that they don't do as well. The Avengers movies are a ton of fun, but they're also like massive CGI fests. I love that this movie has little to no CGI. The action is real and it's intense and it's scary. It's dangerous. And I think that is important to the ways that this movie is different. And I love that as a segue to talk a little bit more about some of those action and stunt sequences, because again, I have a deep appreciation for the realism. And this movie is full of, kind of like Heat and other crime dramas like it, this great combination of big, intense, high octane action set pieces. We already talked about the bank heist in the opening. We could talk about the sequence with the commissioner's memorial, where you got the shots firing during the 21 gun salute. They're just these very excellently choreographed action scenes. But you have those set pieces dovetailed with these quieter character arcs, right? And sometimes the quieter scenes are not quiet, right? Sometimes it's the interrogation of the Joker by the Batman, but that is very much a character scene. It's very much more about unpacking who they are as people and as characters and that conflict than it is about driving fast cars and shit blows up. But let's talk more about shit that blows up, because there is a lot of that in this movie. And it's really cool, some of the like different chase sequences. And we're talking about Chicago and Gotham being a city of haves and have-nots. Can we talk about Bruce Wayne driving a Lamborghini under the L train? Because if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about Gotham, I think that sums it up pretty well. So you get stuff like that, but man, we get some great sequences. The motorcycle chase that happens, and you've got these incredible practical stunt sequences. The one in particular that really stands out to me, obviously when you watch it, it's clearly practical, but kind of unbelievable because nowadays it would have been done with CGI. The flipping of the prison convoy, the 18-wheeler that flips onto its backside. That was a real stunt that was done with a stunt driver on Wicker Drive in Chicago, which is crazy. And it so helps the scale of the movie because even today, 14 years later, when that scene comes up and that 18-wheeler flips on its back, my jaw drops every single time. It is such an impressive bit of stunt work and special effects work that just helps add to the realism. Compare that to where the Fast and Furious franchise is on. That type of stuff I just really appreciate. But any thoughts on the action? Really kind of dominates the middle of the film.
I think you said a lot of it, but you can tell a difference. And you really do feel it, the crash. And I think that does add to it how real everything is. And I do think it would have taken away had they done too much CGI. I mean, even something as simple like you had kind of said about like just cars crashing into things, like that takes a ton of planning. So imagine what comes into something like we're going to flip this 18-wheeler.
I mean, they did do some practical elements in the Batman. Like, I know there was a few fight scenes in like an L train station. I'm very happy that there seems to be this emphasis around realism when it comes to the Batman character, because I think it's so important. Batman is different than the X-Men. He's different than the Avengers. He's even different than, if we're staying with the DC universe, the Superman and the Wonder Woman of the world. Batman is a real dude without superpowers. And so that realism becomes so important. And I love that the action scenes in this movie feed that in a cool way.
Some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
Throughout this movie, it's kind of a hallmark of the Joker. I think this movie does it particularly well, but you also see a little bit of it in the 1989 Batman. This relationship between Joker and the Batman is incredibly personal. It's interesting the way it becomes personal because Joker largely is a character that lacks motivation, but he also understands how to get after Batman and Bruce Wayne. He knows what buttons to push, and I think we see that a few times in this movie, specifically in the sequence in which Harvey Dent and Rachel Dawes in-laws have been kidnapped, and he's tasked with, you can only save one of them, essentially. And I immediately thought of other Batman stories like A Death in the Family. For those that aren't familiar with the comic books, A Death in the Family is an infamous comic book from the late 80s, I believe it was, or early 90s, which asked comic book readers to call a 900 number to vote on whether they thought Robin should live or die at the end of the story. Spoiler alert, they killed him. It's interesting the way that becomes the focus of the Joker. At one point in the movie, Joker even says the line, "I don't want to kill you. What would I do without you?" This relationship between the two characters is inseparable, and it's interesting the way that they come from similar spaces, even though they end at different ends. And I feel like that's the one through line that seems to be consistent of all Batman-Joker relationship portrayals, but especially in this movie.
One of my favorites, a newer one, but it's Death of the Family. Joker feels Batman has gotten soft, so in it he's decided that he's going to kidnap and kill all the Bat family. It's a little monologue about how pupils will widen like everything, and when they get to a certain width that conveys love, he's talking about how he sees that in Joker's eyes, like Joker loves Batman. I don't truly think Joker would ever kill Batman. He doesn't want to.
Well, last but not least, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the ending of the film. And there are two pieces to the ending. So we obviously have the Joker and the Batman's final confrontation in the building. Batman is using his sonar to locate all of the henchmen in the building, and then ultimately has his final confrontation with the Joker over the ledge. I was fascinated that this was, like many parts of this film, filmed in a real place in Chicago. So the fact that there's no face on the building, it was filmed at that time, under construction Trump International Hotel, which is right on the Chicago River. However, the people who were constructing the building were not willing to let the SWAT people who fall out of the building, they didn't want the insurance of that because that's real. There's no CGI. They're all really dangling like 40 stories above the Chicago River, but they actually filmed it at a different building. The Joker's fall in that movie, which of course is stopped by Batman, Heath Ledger actually did that fall. He specifically asked to do it. There's a lot that happens in that final confrontation. Joker gets his final say, and then it ultimately ends up leading us to the closing of the film where Batman is going into hiding. Dent is kind of propped up as the hero that it turns out he wasn't, but it's the hero that the city needs. And then we get the amazing final monologue from Commissioner Gordon, who kind of rounds out the ending of the film. Everything about that just reads like they nailed the middle chapter of a trilogy, because if you look at all the best middle chapters of a trilogy, they end on a dark note. The most iconic obviously is Empire Strikes Back. Like, you put that up at the top. At the end of Empire Strikes Back, the heroes are losing. Darth Vader and the Empire are winning. And I think that's where we end this movie too. Gotham has lost some of its identity. Batman has been beaten down and is going into hiding. We're left with a Gotham that is somewhat in turmoil. Josh, any thoughts on the ending?
One thing with Joker falling that was kind of a cool reference to the 89 Batman where Joker falls. Harvey Dent's story not being over, I thought was, like you said, you still ended on a dark note. Batman's hunted, his kids, like, well, he didn't do anything, and that's key for all heroes. Like, in a hero story, they have to falter. That's what makes them interesting. To me, I've always thought villains have made the hero, and everyone on the movie just did an incredible job of creating something that just really showed the depth and darkness of the city and of Batman.
The hero needs to falter in order to step up. It's almost tragic because Harvey Dent arrives at that near the end of the second act when he talks about things seem bleak, but it's always darkest before the dawn. But dawn is coming. The sad thing is it didn't come before he exited the story.
Look what I did to this city with a few drums of gas and a couple of bullets. You know what I noticed? Nobody panics when things go according to plan. Even if the plan is horrifying. If tomorrow I tell the press that, like, a gangbanger will get shot, or a truckload of soldiers will be blowing up, nobody panics. Because it's all part of the plan. But when I say that one little old mare will die, well, then everyone loses their minds.
I mean, there's obviously a lot of themes and things that the Nolans were trying to say with this movie. But for you, Josh, what are your big takeaways from the film, and what do you feel the film is trying to tell us?
Again, it's on the nose, but like the whole it's darkest before the dawn kind of thing, even though it ends on a sour note. One of the themes which I didn't get at the time, but then after rewatching it and kind of reading into it, is with the whole surveillance thing, the cell phone sonar and all that. You could tell it was definitely a comment on post 9/11 world, like how much privacy do we give up versus in exchange for security. And, even though it ends darkly, it does try to give you a little bit of that dawn.
I don't think they were trying to be overly political, but you can tell that they're trying to say something, right, about our post 9/11 Patriot Act world, stuff that we're still dealing with today. You can shift the conversation from the government to Meta or Twitter or TikTok or any one of these other companies, and the amount of information we give the Apples and Googles and Amazons of the world. So there's some really interesting commentary about the rapid acceleration of technology and how it can be used for good, but also how it can be used for bad. And we literally see that played out in the film, where Bruce has built this advanced sonar system from technology that Lucius put together, and Lucius becomes appalled at the work that he's done. He's horrified that his invention has become this device for, really invasive surveillance. You start thinking about things like the guy that invented nuclear fission and the development of the atomic bomb. That commentary is there, and it's pretty plain. And we feel triumphant about it at the end because Bruce Wayne gives Lucius the ability to destroy it. And it goes back to those characters as being pillars of incorruptible good. I think that's really compelling. I also love the way that you kind of framed up, that we do get these positive notes ultimately, because the whole film, for all of its big bombastic action sequences, is actually an incredibly nuanced meditation on good and evil. I was so struck by that on these rewatches. Like, I got it the first time I watched it, but really soaking it in with like a couple of repeat viewings, it just stood out to me. That's the character story that we're being told. Clearly, the Nolan brothers have us arriving at certain conclusions about heroism and what makes a hero and corruptible and incorruptible good. But beyond the conclusions that the film helps us arrive at, it's noteworthy how much time it spends meditating on those points and just kind of showing us different spaces of good and evil and different ways that good and evil play out, because you've got the Joker butted up against the mobsters. You've got Bruce Wayne butted up against Commissioner Gordon and Harvey Dent, and these different kind of representations of good and evil. But I think more so how it spends so much of its runtime examining those questions without actually solving some of those questions. Joker is still a man without morals. Batman is still a problematic pillar of good. To your point, we get some light at the end of it. Everything in between is filled with picking at the scab, like just analyzing it and just putting up these representations that leave you without answers. I think the other thing that really stood out to me throughout the film was the way that it constantly questions truth. We even see that a little bit in the viciousness of the media, the Anthony Michael Hall character chasing after Reese down to the lobby with his cameraman, trying to capture his potential murder, and the way that he invites all these crazy characters onto his news show, which just further stokes the chaos. It's an interesting analog and commentary on the media that I think is still salient in 2022. Throughout this movie, trust is a problem. And so it's interesting the way that the movie also erodes truth in that way. All these questions about who can trust who. Can the mob trust the Joker? Can they trust Lau, who's taken all their money to Hong Kong? All of these characters lack trust, and they don't ever really fix those issues. And when they do, they're not necessarily rewarded for it. Like, Batman ultimately thinks that Harvey Dent is the guy, the pillar, and he puts his trust in that. He is still corrupted by the actions of the Joker. Again, he endures some awful shit, but I think that that commentary is still there. This movie is full of anxious, who can you trust questions, and reflects the anxiety of its time that I don't think has lessened. This movie has never been more relevant than it is today.
Batman! Why is he running, Dad?
Because we have to chase him.
Okay, we're going in! Go, go! Move!
He didn't do anything wrong.
Because he's the hero Gotham deserves. But not the one it needs right now. So we'll hunt him. Because he can take it. Because he's not our hero. He's a silent guardian, a watchful protector, a dark knight.
So Josh, let's wrap this up and bring this in for a climax and talk about big picture final thoughts on the movie. And as always, rate our films, 1 to 99 bottles of whiskey on the wall. Josh, final thoughts on The Dark Knight. Where is this one sit?
I didn't list it in one of my top 5 movies, but after rewatching it for this, like, it's in there. I'm gonna go super, super high. Let's go 95.
I will go pretty high on this movie too. I mean, when we talked about our top 5 comic book movies, this was my number 2 after Into the Spider-Verse. But I think this movie is dark, it's compelling, it's brooding. It is something that we've not seen depicted prior to this in superhero films. Like, it gave us a version of Batman that is probably the most on the nose to comic book Batman, while also giving us just a different kind of storytelling that I appreciate. So this one ranks really high for me. I'm going to match your 95, actually. This is an excellent film, not just in the pantheon of comic book movies, but it's an all-timer. Like, this is one I will probably be revisiting a lot more often. I actually think I want to go back and watch the whole trilogy now. So this one's pretty high up. We're tossing back some whiskey for this one. In addition to wrapping up our conversation on The Dark Knight, this is also us wrapping up our discussion about comic book movies. So we thought it would be fun to talk about the comic book movies that haven't happened yet. We're going to pretend that a movie studio out there has agreed to hear your pitch for a comic book movie. We talked about all the comics that we love, and Lord knows there are plenty of comic book stories that have yet to be told or that are worth revisiting. If you were to pitch a movie to a studio based on a comic book, what comic are you adapting, and is there any particular story that you'd want to tell it?
One, I wanted to give myself a rule that I couldn't do anything that has been done in live action or animated. One is Arkham: A Serious House on Serious Earth. Arkham Asylum video game series is kind of inspired by it, but to do an actual adaptation where you have Batman going in, dealing with his rogues gallery. That comic is very dark. The other one I would really like is a comic, Kingdom Come. Superman, the Justice League in general have all retired. They have had generations of heroes come since then. Those heroes basically just spend the whole time battling each other.
I like that. I love that you gave some thought too to like the medium, like how it would be portrayed. Any casting that you'd be particularly, like, you feel strongly about?
I have always wanted to see Willem Dafoe as Joker.
Oh, okay.
I think he would make there's shades of that with his Green Goblin thing. Part of it is just his body type, that smile he has. Everyone is seeing him smile. I actually, in my head, if I'm ranking Jokers, I put his hypothetical performance so far above Jared Leto's actual performance.
That's awesome. I'd be very interested to see either of those movies. I think that'd be great. I went a little bit of a different direction, and since you applied a rule to yours, I'll apply the same rule to mine, but I will give an honorable mention to some others I considered that your rule makes complex. And this one, I guess maybe I was thinking about because I just went to the theater a few days ago and watched the movie The Black Phone, which is based on a Joe Hill short story. But it had me thinking that in addition to like the short stories and novels, Joe Hill has written a ton of graphic novels and comic books for Vertigo and DC. I would love to see an adaptation of his story, A Basket Full of Heads. And I think part of the reason why I went this path was because I feel like there's so many good horror and sci-fi comics out there that would be great to get some love in addition to all these awesome superhero stories. It would be played a little bit edgy, humorous. Like if you remember the movie Idle Hands, where it's kind of like darkly comic, while also being kind of like gross and scary. And I think the other big one, and this is just because we can't do 2 episodes of comic books and not let me get in my most important antagonism of the worst Marvel thing that's ever been committed to film. I would like them to do a proper film on the Weapon X story, because fuck that X-Men Origins movie. That movie was unadulterated trash. It's one of the worst things I've ever seen, not even just of comic book movies. We want to hear from you. Give us a call on the Whiskey Flick hotline at 818-660-6369 or tag us on social media at Whiskey Flick Pod to share your comic book movie pitches with us to be featured on the show. As we bring this all in for a landing, Josh, we got to talk a little bit about the soundtrack. Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard did an incredible job with the score and soundtrack of this film. For you, Josh, what is your soundtrack for this week? One of the cuts from the movie, or is there something else you're listening to?
A lot of Bleachers, actually. My wife introduced them to me. We're expecting a child. I think I'm just being sentimental.
I like that. Any particular song?
Let's Get Married. I wanted it played at our wedding so bad, but it was just too on the nose.
Let's get married.
That's awesome. I think that's definitely, yeah, Bleacher's always worth a good shout out. I will give a shout out to a song that I thought of as I had finished the final prep for this. My song choice is inspired by me discovering the Matt Skiba cameo in this movie. I mean, the themes are not necessarily spot on, but there's some interesting lyrical overlaps. So I'll give a shout out to the song Burn by Alkaline Trio.
There's a forest fire burning bright, spreading quickly towards our last rites. Nowhere to run, pointless to hide, just lay there and scream, pretending to try, pretending, intending to burn, pretending to fight it. Everyone learns faster on fire, things took a turn. Lost of desire, you live and you burn. You live and you burn.
Well, last but not least, Josh, as always, we want to give us an opportunity to unload those thoughts that have been living in our head rent-free this week. Josh, what is living in your head rent-free?
My wife will be annoyed by this, but we went grocery shopping the other day, and I point it out every time we go. It is absolute bullshit that bananas and cream oatmeal is not sold by itself. The only way you will find bananas and cream oatmeal is in the variety pack, but then you have to eat peaches and cream and blueberries and cream, and I'm not a fan of it. You can get banana and walnuts, which is kind of stupid, and I don't need 12 packs of that. I might try one. If I ever find a bananas and cream oatmeal pack, I will buy every box.
That is amazing. I will definitely be looking into that. I'm going to keep my rant short and sweet this week. The return of San Diego Comic-Con, like that literally inspired these last 2 episodes. It's been 3 years since Comic-Con has happened in San Diego. So I'm very excited to spend time with my nerdy friends and family. Josh, thanks again for joining us for our comic book adventures. It's been a lot of fun doing both these episodes with you.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I don't have a lot of people to talk about this stuff with. My wife gets sick of hearing it, and my kid only wants to play Batman. He doesn't want to discuss the depth of Batman anymore, so...
Thanks again to our guest Josh Callas for joining us on our double feature comic book adventure. And as always, thanks to you for checking out Whiskey Flick. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on the latest episodes. And with great power comes great responsibility. So let us know how we're doing with a review to help others find the show. Remember to call the Whiskey Flick hotline at 818-660-6369 to share your thoughts on The Dark Knight, Batman, and comic book movies. You can also hit us up on social media at Whiskey Flick Pod to join our polls or share your takes, or email us at whiskeyflickpod@gmail.com. We'll be back in your feeds again next weekend with another double feature to kick off the NFL season. First up, we'll be joined by our special guest, Dad the Gamer, to talk about the Kurt Warner biopic, American Underdog, and football movies. As always, we got to shout out our friends Tony and Matt at the 58 West King podcast and Nate at the Taco Court podcast. They've just dropped some new episodes to help get you ready for football season. You can find their links in our show notes. Thanks as always for checking out Whiskey Flick, and we'll see you next weekend for American Underdog with Dad the Gamer. Until then, keep the whiskey flowing and the flicks going. We'll see you next time.
As long as there is whiskey in the world, as long as there is whiskey, as long as there is whiskey, as long as there is whiskey in the world.
Football. Tell me about that.
As long as I have a ball in my hands, I feel alive. Kind of like how I feel right now.
I'm staying here. I got work to do.
Work? The NFL's not going to draft some dude from the 1AA school in Iowa.
There were other offers. Can't you just...
I called every team in the NFL. No one's interested.
Can I get one of your applications? I promised that I would take care of you and the kids. So that is exactly what I'm going to do.
If this is your dream, don't give up on it.
Football.
Yeah, they didn't pick me.
I pick you.
I pick you too.
Kurt Warner. You got the whole package, kid. The world just needs more time to see it.
He came up with this whole arena concept.
Arena football.
It's like a circus.
People love the circus.
I like the circus.
You pay me per touchdown?
I also pay you to win.
Oh, that's gonna be fun.
Hey, Kurt.
We've been trying to reach you.
I'm sorry, who are you?
I'm with the Rams.
This guy's old. Slow as molasses. He's beneath the standards of this franchise.
That's what people said about me when I came here. All those years gave you something others didn't have. Made you ready for this moment.
Kurt Warner out of the Arena League. It's one of those stories that's too good for the movies. It's perfect.
This guy here, he was bagging groceries 5 years ago.
Go out there and you show the world what I've known all along. You were born for this.
This is my time. I know who I am, and I know why I'm here.